Good evening.
Good evening.
Yes.
Evening.
All right. We can do better.
Good evening.
All right. So, it's my great pleasure to first introduce our amazing leaders who are joining us this evening. We're going to do this, as you all know, we do this a little differently each week, depending on who's with us and how they also want to participate with this discussion. So we have Vince Warren, who's the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He oversees CCR's groundbreaking litigation and advocacy work. That includes both international and domestic law to hold corporations and government accountable. Many of you may know that CCR and Vince were really part of the central team around fighting stop and frisk in New York City, that as well as detention in Guantanamo and many other critically important human rights issues. I'm not going to read his entire bio because it's lengthy and impressive and makes me feel bad about myself. But I do suggest that you check out Center for Constitutional Rights website for the amazing work that they're doing. It's also my tremendous pleasure to introduce Sam Sinyangwe, who's a policy analyst and data scientist who works with communities of color to fight systemic racism through cutting-edge policies and strategies. And Sam has supported movement activists across the country collecting data and developing tools to fight police violence through the Mapping the Police Violence Project, which you may have seen some of those maps, and certainly you should follow Sam on Twitter because he puts a lot of that data out there. And also Campaign Zero, which is a comprehensive platform to end police violence. Sam also worked at PolicyLink, which, to support a national network of 61 promised neighborhood communities to develop community strategies around cradle-to-career opportunities. So again, both Vince and Sam are both incredible minds and have an impressive body of work. I wanted to just start, so we're going to do this much more informally in terms of more of a discussion amongst us. But before we did, I wanted to quickly lay out just some baseline facts to make sure we were all starting from the same place. Many of you are already going to know a lot of the facts that I'm going to share, and probably a lot more. But so that we're not making assumptions, I want to make sure that we are at least on the same page. So one of the things that's important to know when we talk about race and criminalization, and note I didn't say race and crime. I said race and criminalization because they're not always synonymous. And this chart, I think, which is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, is such an important example, which is showing how incarceration rates have risen almost steadily since the late 70s as we started to see violent crime and property crime basically consistently go down. Right? And so that in and of itself, this map already tells us we have a problem because it doesn't really make much sense, right? Our incarceration rates should be mapping to our crime rates. And this is just to summarize what this means, because usually people go to, it must be about criminal activity that's not, somehow getting captured in those crime rates, and this is really important that by this, the National Research Council report, the measure of the ratio of arrests to crimes, right? By the measure of the ratio of arrests to crimes, no increase in policing effectiveness occurred from 1980 to 2010. That might explain higher incarceration rates, because what people usually go to is something's happening with policing that's catching more bad guys. And that's why incarceration rates are going up, even if crime rates are staying steady and going down. But we have research that actually says, no, we can't find that, right? So then we have to talk a little bit about what's happening. I'm just going to give a snapshot, because so often when we're talking about the criminal justice system, we forget about the constructed conditions for communities that create the over-incarceration and over-policing in the first place, right? So just one brief little important history of this is suburbanization and the way we as a nation suburbanized, meaning had literal, in some instances, white flight, explicitly white flight out of cities into suburbs, but also a lot of policies that incentivized the creation of suburbs and made it harder for people of color to actually relocate to those suburbs that in some instances were intentional, in some instances were just setting it up to make it harder for people of color. That's a whole nother lecture. You'll have to take my race policy and discourse class for that one. But suffice it to say that if we in creating the suburbs we created, even if you look as late as 1970 and 1980, center cities had net job losses in the kinds of jobs low-income communities with low educational attainment might get. And it's not that there wasn't job growth in cities, but it was managerial, professional, technical. In other words, the kinds of jobs you had to have a lot higher educational level to get. And one of the things then we saw was, so jobs were increasing in cities, but not the jobs that a lot of low-income communities with high unemployment could get. And by the way, we weren't investing in the public transportation to get people from center cities to the jobs in the suburbs. And most of our public transportation and road policies were to enable people from the suburbs to come into the cities for those managerial jobs, right? But what there is then is a correlation in an increase in unemployment, particularly Black unemployment, whites moving out of the cities, and then suburbanization as a predictor not just of unemployment, but of crime rates. Because any community where you concentrate poverty will usually have higher crime rates, no matter the race of the community. All we have to do is talk about the opioid crisis to actually think about what that represents even today, right? So that's just as a snapshot to say even how we understand the conditions that create crime, we can't separate that from racialization, right? So if we look at incarceration rates, the numbers are terrible. Prison population grew 700% between 1970 and 2005. For women, it increased 800% over 3 decades. See, people, that's the other thing. The intersection between race and gender sometimes gets lost. Although the overall numbers are lower, Black women are 3 times more likely than white to be incarcerated. Latinas, 69% more likely, okay? So a highly racialized picture. Native Americans do not collect data as accurately as we do for other communities, but where there's data, it's very clear that Native Americans are imprisoned at over 4 times the rate of whites. So the racialized picture of who is being incarcerated is pretty clear. If we just look at state prisons, we see very similar and disturbing numbers. Black people incarcerated, because that previous number was all incarceration, so that includes federal. Black people incarcerated at 5 times the rate of whites. We have 5 states where the ratio is 10 to 1. And by the way, New Jersey tops this list in our region. Same in Maryland, just going to throw it out there because 72% of the state prison population is Black in Maryland. 72%. Latinos are in prison 3 to 4 times the rate of whites. All right, so we have disparities in the criminal justice system. We commonly think of the criminal justice system there's several points along the trajectory: police, prosecution, court, corrections, and then what's happening in communities. I would argue you have to put that community lens before the police lens as well as after the corrections, right? Because there's what's happening in communities before even there's police contact, but we'll talk about that a little. I'm going to run through a bunch of stats. They're all bad. That's the preview. Guess what? They're all bad. They're all racialized. But look, like we talked about the fact that crime, violent crime, and property crime were going down. If you look at New York City stop and frisks, you also see an increase in stops and frisks. Over the same period of time, we're seeing a decline in violent and property crime, right? So what does that tell you about the front end of the criminal justice system? Something's happening with police contact at the first end because you're not entering the system without that contact. And it's highly racialized. This just gives you the race numbers. Red is Black. Green is Hispanic. Purple is Asian. Blue is white. So that tells you what the race of people stopped looks like in New York City, which is not the percentage of those populations in the city. This is also, because we have driving while black in the country, also shows even drivers are disproportionately stopped by race. Drug-related arrests by race, obviously significantly higher in the black community than the white community. As we know, I don't have a slide up here, but as we know, there is rampant drug use in white communities. There is. Okay, that's all I'll say on that. Detention status after arraignment. Again, every point of contact in the criminal justice system is racialized, is disproportionately people of color. Detention status after arraignment, meaning instead of being released while you're waiting on those charges, you're being held, obviously significantly higher jail than bail for black versus white defendants. Plea offers, you're much more likely to get jail time as part of your plea offer if you're black than if you're white. You're much more likely to get stricken from the jury pool that will make a decision about whether there is guilt or innocence in the case if you are black. Getting the picture here? Distribution of prison sentences. The prison sentences are longer for people who are black. The disparity between black and white parolees, meaning who gets out on parole. I can go on and on. The incarceration rates itself, why? Policies like sentencing guidelines, practices. There's bias in the system at every point in the system. Some of it's implicit, some of it is not. And then we have the structural disadvantages, which I mentioned at the front end, which is what creates the problems, the core underlying problems in the first place, are a range of other policy decisions that fundamentally disinvest in communities of color. I'm going to stop there so we can open up to conversation, but that's the snapshot. All right, now that you're all getting mad. Our live stream audience. Woo! So Sam, let's start with you because let's start with policing. What are you seeing, and based on the data you're seeing, what's your analysis about how police interaction with community is contributing to incarceration rates? Yeah, it should work. Just turn it on.
Hello, how about now? No?
Oh,
Yes?
there you go.
All right. So I think, first of all, the slides that you showed really are telling, and what the story that they tell is that at every level of the system is more harsh towards black people than it is towards white people. And what's also interesting about that is that those effects compile. They compound. So if you are more likely to be stopped by police, searched by police, arrested by police for the same activity as a white person, you are more likely to be killed by police. If you're not killed by police, you're more likely to have force used against you during that interaction. And then after that arrest, your entire journey through the system at each point is you have a higher probability of a worse outcome. So much so, but by the time you get out of that system, if you get out of that system, your probability of having a negative outcome is just so astronomically higher than a white person who did the exact same thing. So that's one of the things to think about, is that usually when we talk about this, we talk about a segment of the system. So whether it's the policing side, or we're talking about bail, and we're talking about prosecution, we're talking about sentencing, we're talking about release and probation and parole, each of these segments of it, but when you add it all together, the effect really is extremely severe. So my work is focused on the front end of that system, on the policing side. In particular, it has been focused on since August 9th, 2014, when Mike Brown Jr. was killed in Ferguson. When I got into this work, it has been focused on collecting data on police interactions with communities to better understand how police are interacting with communities, in particular when those interactions turn violent, when police are violent and community members are hurt or killed. What explains those outcomes? Why is it, when we collected this data, one of the first things we found was that black people were 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people, and more likely to be unarmed. And so the question is, why is that the case? And how do we effectively use the data to actually get at solutions? Because I think so often in these conversations, we're in a place where we are talking about huge structural problems, and it can be very overwhelming. But it's important to note that it was a series of policies and practices that got us to this place. And so it is not something that just happened that is just sort of the natural way that things always are and will always be. These are intentional decisions by decision makers, many of whom are elected by us. And this can be undone, right? Justice systems can be built, systems can be deconstructed and replaced. And so I think at a high level, that's what my work focuses on. In a more particular piece of it, it looks at when you are in a community, what is your probability of having an interaction with police, and what's the probability that those interactions turn violent? And so to give you some statistics, young Black people, Black millennials, between the ages of 18 and 29, the majority, 54%, have either personally experienced police violence or know somebody personally who's experienced police violence. So this is how deep it is, to the extent where most folks who look like me will have known somebody or personally experienced violence at the hands of the state. So it is incredibly deep and widespread. And so our work is really focused on addressing those issues through policy change.
Can you, before we go to Vince, which you're going to get the same question except on all the levels of the criminal justice system, but say a little bit more, Sam, about the policy opportunity. We'll come back to it, but just give us a couple of high lines on the policy possibilities that the data helps suggest.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, policing has changed over the past several decades. So similar to those charts showing the growth of mass incarceration, those coincide with the adoption of the war on drugs, of broken windows policing, a style of policing that has focused an intensive and expanding amount of resources and police officers in communities of color, focusing on what they call low-level or broken windows offenses. And New York City created this strategy, is sort of the champion of this strategy. Even today, Mayor de Blasio, this is his strategy. He supports this as well. I mean, they've been doing this for decades, right? And so what this means is that all of a sudden, you are now subject to arrest and police intervention for doing really low-level stuff. So having really loud music, or having a small amount of marijuana or an open container of alcohol, or jumping a turnstile at the subway. Things that had not previously been the explicit focus of policing. It tended to be decades before that police would respond when called, and that it was still racist, but the level of policing of those lower level offenses was much lower than it is today. And the tactics and strategies, the militarization of those approaches has also increased. And so those are some of the broader trend lines that we've seen over the past several decades that have got us to where we are today, where so many resources are concentrated in policing and incarceration, and so many people, particularly Black and brown people, are being caught up in this sort of dragnet that is catching people for the smallest of things and ending up leaving you with a really severe consequence if you survive that encounter at all.
And just to note, because we also talked about indigenous communities a couple classes ago, is that we see the same patterns even in rural communities with large numbers of, where there are native reservations and large number of native peoples, as well as urban. So that racialization pattern can exist in a lot of different types of communities. Vince, do you want to hand it? Yeah, thanks. Jump in.
Yeah, so just picking up where you left off, Sam, there are a lot of, I think, really important, it's important to understand how this happens in addition to what is happening. So I want to talk a little bit about that. The first part is about policing. The second part will be about prosecutorial decisions and lawmaking. Just to add on to what Sam said, the policing issue is a tremendous challenge. And I think for reasons that Sam laid out is that there's been a trend towards community intervention, the idea that we're not policing all of our streets in the same way, that there's certain blocks, there's certain neighborhoods that we're policing more intensely than others. And the general thinking around that societally has been, well, that might not be such a bad idea. If there are pockets of crime in particular areas, maybe we should police these places a little bit more intensely than others. Let me tell you how that plays out. Number one is, for anybody that has not been subject to a police stop, one thing I would say to you is that please don't think that it's the same type of stop that happens when you're in your car and you're speeding. It is an entirely different type of stop. The police department in any jurisdiction is likely the only government entity that will tell you to get the fuck up against the wall. So think about what that means for a second. And even if they don't touch
DMV
you,
might.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, and maybe the post office as well, because I get a little testy in the post office. But not to shoot it up or anything, because we're on the live cam. But the point of that is that think about just what that means to have now a government entity that is now verbally really demeaning you and putting you in a place of defense. The second thing that people need to know is I'm a constitutional lawyer, and there's this wonderful thing called the Fourth Amendment that we had, and the Fourth Amendment protects all of us from unreasonable searches and seizures. And so when we're protected from unreasonable searches and seizures, that means that the police can't come up to you for absolutely no reason or because of your race alone or your gender alone and even stop you. They can't even ask you a question. They can't even ask you your name. But if we think about the following situation, show of hands, if a police officer came up to you walking down the street and said, I need you to do the hokey pokey right now, how many of you would stop what you're doing and do the hokey pokey? One hand, two hands, three hands. People are thinking about what the cost of not doing the hokey pokey is, right? The point there is that there are functional equivalents in various communities. Get on the ground, stop what you're doing, empty your pockets, let me ask you about this guy, where are you going? A whole range of things that the police actually constitutionally have no business asking you that are part of the daily interaction, as Sam was talking about. People who have who come into increasing likelihood of contact with police officers in these neighborhoods have increasing likelihood of intervention by police officers. Okay, so now what happens if you decide you don't do the hokey pokey or you don't empty your pocket? This is the other piece about where communities are criminalized. You have a constitutional right, if the police department has no reason for stopping you, to not do the thing that they're asking you to do. But the way that our police officers are trained, that they're trained to see non-compliance as escalation. So if they tell you to get up against the wall, or if they tell you to get down on the ground and you don't, they see that as an escalation because you're not complying with their commands. Next thing you know, they're at the next level. Next thing you know, that they're calling in backup. It's an increasingly violent situation that can happen just from you being passive. So that's another thing for people to really understand. In terms of the stop and frisk context, as Maya was talking about, we, the Center for Constitutional Rights, litigated that case for a total of about 13 years, and we won it in 2013, where the the trial court, after a 9.5-week trial, said that the New York City stop and frisk program was unconstitutional. But what's important about that is there are really two things. One is a societal element and the other one is a legal element. The legal element is that the police department were 87% of the people that they were stopping in New York City over a period of time were Black and Latino, 87%. They had a 90% fail rate in terms of stopping people versus people being charged with crimes. 10% of the people that they stopped, and at one year it was over 600,000 people in a year, 5 million people over between 9/11 and 2011. All of these cases, only 10% of the people that they stopped either got a summons because they had done something wrong or were arrested, which means that it's a 90% fail rate. Now, at the time that it was a 90% fail rate, many people in New York, and this is the societal element, were thinking along the lines of what Maya was talking about. Well, crime is bad. Crime must be going up. This is actually a good thing. When in fact, we know that crime
And some presidents actually have argued it despite the counterfactual.
And some presidents did, and some presidents continue to, and even former mayors of New York did that. The important piece there is that societally, we become drivers of these types of policies if we don't really understand these facts that are happening. So the point that I want to tell you about where the stop and frisk case ended, which was interesting, was when we started that litigation, and this are according to New York Times and other polling, that most people thought that stop and frisk was a good thing because it kept us safer against crime. By the time we got to 2013, and and this is before Mike Brown, when we were winning these cases and putting up these points about the numbers, most New Yorkers began to feel that stop and frisk was actually not a crime-fighting tool, it was a racially discriminatory policy. And that's part of the shift that I think is important for this discussion, and I think also important for people to understand that our policing policies are not baked into our DNA, that these are intentional decisions that we make very often on faulty information that preys upon people's intuitive sense of who's dangerous, which communities are crime-ridden, who's the most likely to commit a crime, that these intuitive senses begin to drive some of these policies that are moving forward, and they're hard to unbake. The last thing I want to say is about prosecution. An example of this, and speaking about the gendered piece, we did a case in Louisiana a couple of years ago, and we got a report that, check this out, about 40% of the people on the sex offender registry in Louisiana were women. 40% of the people on the sex offender registry were women. Most of you are thinking, okay, what is wrong with that picture? What it really was about was it was about a 200-year-old law that was called the Crime Against Nature Act. And what it did was it punished anal and oral sex more harshly than vaginal sex if you're soliciting for it. So essentially it went after sex workers. And over a period of time, for people that were convicted of that first category, they had to register as sex offenders. And it had the following impact on the community. Number one, when you registered as a sex offender, as someone that was convicted of this crime, you had to get on your driver's license stamped in big red letters, sex offender. Number two, you had to pay for an ad in your local paper that says you are a sex offender. Number three, which is the standard sex offender thing, is that if you're a convicted sex offender, you can't live within 1,000 feet of a school, and you can't visit school campuses. So think about sex workers who have children, who now can have no interaction with their child's school under the law. And then the other thing was, for those of you who remember Hurricane Katrina, during the evacuation, they had two different types of shelters. They had the people who would go to the shelters who were not sex offenders, and the people that were convicted sex offenders had to go to a shelter all the way in the north of Louisiana. So it created the situation, particularly for sex workers or women with children, that they couldn't go to the same shelter that their children were going into. And so this is just what this is pointing out is that maybe 209 years ago, it might be understandable why a law like this would be on the books, but 200 years later, you would have to ask yourself, why is it still on the books, number one? And two, how is this being prosecuted? Why are people being arrested? And why are judges allowing folks to be convicted sex offenders for this type of activity, knowing the consequences? So this is an example, and the vast majority of those women, trans women, and other folks were women of color, Black and Latino. So there is a gendered piece to the criminalization as well, where it actually begins to seep in and destroy communities, even though the law on its face looks like it applies to everybody.
Sam, so I'm wondering if you actually alluded to it in your opening remarks, and I want to go there in terms of bail, right? Because when we're talking about the system, it's both what happens with the stops, so who's being stopped, then there's what happens once they're stopped, not just in terms of their Fourth Amendment rights, but what decisions are being made about whether they're being arrested, and then if they're arrested, what happens to them once they get arrested. And as we know, it's not just whether you're convicted, it's how long you're detained and where you're detained. And of course, we're in a city that's talking about reimagining Rikers. So can you just say a little bit more about bail?
Yeah, so bail is a huge issue, and it's an issue because a huge proportion of people who are currently in jail are in jail not because of the severity of what they are accused of doing. Many of them have not been convicted of a crime. They are there because they don't have the money to pay bail. And so what this means is that if you are rich and guilty, it is often easier for you, the system is easier on you than it is if you are poor and innocent. And this shows up in many different spaces, and it is not only sort of a a class piece, there's also a racial element to this as well. When you look at, in many places, who are the low-income people that are held in jail on bail because they can't pay bail? They're almost always Black and Latino. And so that's one issue that more and more is sort of being acknowledged. So you having efforts, so in New Jersey, for example, they have recently changed and essentially abolished cash bail, which has reduced drastically the population of folks that are in jail. But now what you're seeing is a transition to determining bail based on sort of your risk to the community. And so there's a lot of conversation now about how do you actually effectively do that. So if we're not determining whether or not what your bail amount is based on what the severity of the crime is, but we're using a variety of different factors that can be whether you have a past criminal record, whether you are in some places whether you have a parent or a family member who has been incarcerated, whether you live in a community that has a high crime rate. Things that are often proxies for race that are now being used to actually determine whether or not you will be released or held in jail. And so sort of the new front now, as we move to phase out the use of cash bail and to make everything conditional on your ability to pay, is to now make something where how are we actually making sure that we're being fair in who actually gets bail and who doesn't get bail. And when you're looking at the particular risk assessments that they use to make those decisions, a report from ProPublica recently came out which showed that there was a lot of bias used by incorporating those types of factors that are often racialized, where people are being held in bail not because they're more of a threat to the community, but because a range of risk factors are identified that are proxies for race that keep people in jail. So that's sort of there are two battles being fought simultaneously now, depending on sort of what system you're operating in. But both of them are sort of necessary if we're going to dramatically reduce the jail population and to make it more equitable in terms of how it is treating people.
So a lot of what we're talking about, policy happens at multiple levels, right? There's federal level and there's state and there's local. Policies are also made by institutions like prosecutors or the police department. And in this instance, one of the things that strikes me is judges right now don't have to impose cash bail without a change to law. So sometimes we're doing law change because we're not seeing judges use their discretion to say it doesn't make sense or not even necessarily understanding we're criminalizing poverty, because I think the statistic is something like 15% of people can't pay bail if it's less than $2,000. Okay, so that's actually incarcerating poverty, because if you have the ability to pay, right? This was Khalif Browder, for those of you who remember that tragic story in New York. It was a very low, shouldn't have been arrested in the first place. He had a very low bail but couldn't afford it. He refused. Most people in that instance then are required, they're basically browbeaten into taking a plea and having a criminal record. He refused to take the plea, but that meant he was in Rikers for 2 years. And then there are the issues of what happens in confinement, so solitary confinement that deeply impacted his emotional well-being and led to his deciding to take his own life. That's just I think we all have to remember Khalif Browder when we have this conversation about bail. But I'm wondering then from you, Vince, if you want to start, and I'm going to come back to you on the same question, Sam, but given these multiple levels of institutional policy making, right, from legislative to all layers of government to specific agencies and offices, where in your view is the most important place to intervene if you had to pick one or two? And what is the role of culture change within the institutions, and where does it need to happen first?
Well, the role of culture change is probably the most important thing. There's this old saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and politics follow culture. So that if you shift the culture, then the politics begin to shift. And so I think that's important, but that's a massive undertaking, which I think is overwhelming to folks. A couple of things I wanted to say. I'm not sure what the most important intervention is, but I'll tell you what I think the cutting edge intervention is right now, and it's actually
even better.
It's actually private. It's privatization of criminalized function, and so in terms of the bail work nationally around the country, there are all of these amazing, very often local groups that are pushing for bail reform in their jurisdictions, and they're becoming more and more successful. And the idea there is that the community should be able to provide better solutions to ensure that somebody is coming into court than some sort of financial incentive that doesn't actually incentivize coming back to court. It's incentivized staying in jail. Well, what's interesting about it is that the corporations who are involved in private prisons, the corporations who are making pitches in localities to privatize police departments, are actually seeing a lot of money to be made in the criminal justice field. And simultaneously, counties, we have to remember that we have 50 different criminal justice systems in the United States. Each state has a different one. And then within each state, each county has a different function. Sometimes it's municipalities as well. So we have to remember that there's a lot of money that's happening. And in the concept of, in the sort of the current concept where the counties and states are crying poverty, and that there's not enough money to go around, one of the places that the reason why you have these right-left coalitions around criminal justice is because the idea is we're spending too much money on criminal justice. What we're saying, I think, on our side of the V is that we're actually spending too little money investing in communities and too much money investing in criminal justice. In their perspective, they might say that we're spending too much money on both. The point is that the corporations are beginning to figure this out. So some corporations who were involved in monitoring and helping with bail situations and also monitoring the jail situation so that when people were held in bail that the corporations have a contract with the county as a per person thing, they get money. Now they're seeing the writing on the wall. Less people are going to be in jail, so now they're beginning to shift and pitch to counties that we want to help with these assessment tools, right? So you have so while government is sort of slow to figure out how they get out of this sort of cultural swamp, investors and corporations are much more nimble. They are not invested in people staying in jail. They're invested in making money from people that come through the criminal justice system, whether they are in jail or not. So that we have a sort of an incentivized structure so that no matter what ends up happening, either the county is going to benefit by increasingly using bail as a way to source county funds, or that the corporations are going to take over, the counties pay less, the money goes to the corporations, but the corporations then do the head count and they get the money for the people that are coming through. So I would say that's really a spot to keep your eye on.
That's important. Sam?
Yeah, so, you know, I often get this question of like, what is the solution?
I actually hate that question, and I only ask it because,
Yes.
like, I get to torture someone else with a really bad.
Yeah, and I think it is torture because there's not one solution, and depending on where you are, it's very different. Because there are 50 different criminal justice systems, and so, you know, depending on your state, you may have a system that relies heavily on cash bail, or you may not. You may have, you know, very severe sentencing, very severe sentences for, you know, drugs, for marijuana, for other things, or you may not. You know, you may have a system that has a lot of people locked up for a very long time in prison, or you may have a system that has a lot of people on probation, where we need to figure out how do we address the system, what it takes for people to be reincarcerated when they're on probation or parole, to make it so you're not thrown back in jail for the smallest of things. So it all depends on sort of where you are. I think ultimately the goal for activists is to figure out, you know, in your jurisdiction, in your state, in your city, what are the key levers of change given the data, and then take action on those. So for example, one thing that was just mentioned was this issue of investing in community versus investing in police and prisons. And this is probably the one thing that holds constant across jurisdictions, and that is that the prevailing approach for dealing with issues of safety and crime over the past several decades, at least, especially, but really throughout, has been an investment in police and prisons as the primary strategy. There are $181 billion spent every year on police and prisons. So how effective is that investment? So you look at a study, for example, from the Brennan Center. They looked at the impact of mass incarceration as a strategy, the impact of increasing the number of police officers on the street as a strategy, on the decline in crime rates that were just cited over the past several decades. And what they found was that mass incarceration as a strategy had no impact on the violent crime rate decline. So you think about how many people, about 1.5 million people in prison, 2.2 million people locked up overall. This 400, or was it 700% or 400%?
Well, 700%.
700% increase in the prison population with no meaningful impact on addressing violent crime.
And we should say a lot of folks arrested were nonviolent offenders to
Right.
begin with, so you wouldn't expect
Right.
nonviolent offenders to reduce a violent crime rate
Right.
because they're not perpetrating violent crime.
Absolutely.
I'm very
Yeah.
smart. I can put those two things in.
Yeah, so you have this huge investment, billions and billions of dollars going to prisons, not addressing the underlying concern about public safety and crime. Same thing with policing. The 94 crime bill is like 100,000 new officers on the streets. There have been all kinds of investments. You look at city budgets, like the largest expenditure in the city's general fund is going to be for police. That in that study, it was found to have between 0 and 5% impact on the violent crime rate, so very, very small. And of course, that's not accounting for the risk that strategy posed to communities. Now contrast that with investing in community. So a study from Patrick Sharkey recently came out that showed that
His
for
new
every
book. It's
Yes.
not out yet. It doesn't
Yes.
have page numbers, but I get to read it first. But
So he found that looking at this decline in crime, he studied something like 267 cities, that an addition of 10, each 10 nonprofit organizations, community organizations that were working on issues of safety, youth development, like working with impacted populations to improve their lives, to expand opportunity, 10 additional organizations in a given city was associated with a 9% drop in the murder rate and a 6% drop in the violent crime rate. Just 10 organizations. So it's very clear that there are solutions. Investing in community not only addresses this issue, but does it in a way that doesn't result in people ending up being locked up, having a criminal record, making it harder for people to get a job, to integrate back into society. It is a win-win, and yet that is not the strategy that city policymakers, that state lawmakers, that this administration has chosen to adopt and to really invest in. And I think we have to be able to flip that paradigm and invest in what works instead of continuing to feed more and more money into the system that actually breaks apart families, breaks apart communities, and makes it much harder to even begin to address those underlying issues.
tax bill, y'all. 1.5 trillion to the budget. Exactly what's going to happen are the spending cuts that are going to undercut even state and local governments who are willing to do it, their ability to find the revenue to do it as they get less dollars from the federal government to do good policy. So I'm going to go to political economy of these issues a little bit. We don't have there's a dissertation or 3 to be written on this, but everything that I think you have raised, both of you, you've talked about the importance of the stereotypes and the implicit biases that are undergirding the system, and part of the reason that people will say, oh, it's because of greater policing, because it's actually because there's been greater crime, is also itself a racialized narrative, right? It's the lots of research that shows, including one from last year, and this was in the context of applying for jobs, not drugs, applying for jobs where researchers identified that even a Black name or a Latino name mapped to the person who heard it larger, more violent, more aggressive. This had nothing to do with any attributes of, this was just a name. You would get a name, which just shows how deeply embedded the stereotypes are in society. And since we're so deeply segregated, we also have very few opportunities, I think, often to interact against stereotype. So, given that, and given some of the opportunities or cutting edge things we have to pay attention to, how are you thinking, and I'm going to start with you on this, Sam, data, right? I mean, one of the things I think that the stop and frisk advocacy and legal work did so effectively is the very data, Vince, that you shared in the beginning to show you can't possibly say this is reasonable policy because the data demonstrates that all these people getting stopped and frisked aren't actually being arrested or charged with any crime. Are there data points that are helpful now on additional issues that you can see, Sam, that you would lift up? And then I'll come to you, Vin.
Yeah, so I think there are many different, it depends on what aspect of the system you want to address. For my work, it has focused on how to address the issue of police violence at sort of the front end of the system. And that is one of those areas where it's actually the least data. So when you're talking about incarceration, once you have entered the system, there's a good amount of data, not the best data, but there's some amount of data. We know how many people are currently in prison. We know what the racial demographics are. We know, how many people are on parole and probation in a given state. So there's something that can be worked with. When you're talking about people being killed by police or, use of force used against them by police, if they're even non-fatal force, there's very little data that you can actually use on a national level to address the issue and to bring light to the issue. And so that's the work that we've done, is building the most comprehensive database of people killed by police in the United States at mapping police violence. And what that has allowed us to do is to use the data points to really advocate for change. So I'll give you some examples. One of the key gaps in the field right now in terms of how do we stop police violence is identifying evidence-based policy solutions that can reduce police violence over time. And that's a problem because, one, we only recently got comprehensive data on people killed by police. We still don't have data on people on non-fatal police encounters. And even then, there are 18,000 police departments in the United States, each with its own policies and practices. So being able to associate a particular policy with a particular outcome is very difficult given all of those gaps of data. So one of the studies that we did looked at the 100 largest police departments in the country and looked at the rates of people killed by police in each of those jurisdictions and mapped that against the use of force policies of those police departments. So each police department has its own use of force policy. And this policy basically, it defines how and when police can use force in particular situations. So, can police tase somebody who is what they call passively resisting, so sitting down, refusing to get up? Or can police shoot somebody even if they haven't given a verbal warning? Or do police have to exhaust all other means of trying to apprehend somebody before they shoot them? So these are basic things, but different police departments have completely different policies on this. Are police required to use de-escalation? All of these things vary. And so what we did was we looked at the departments that had the most restrictive use of force policies and looked at the correlation between those departments, the strictness of those policies, and the likelihood that those police departments will kill a civilian. What we found was that each of the use of force policies we identified, so requiring de-escalation, requiring police exhaust all other means, a taser, verbal warning, all of these other things before using deadly force, prohibiting chokeholds and strangleholds, like all of these things were associated with significant reductions in police killings. And then what we did was we also looked at the impact on the police. And so what we found was that, we try to anticipate, when you're talking about advocating for policy, particularly with this issue, there's a lot of resistance, especially from police unions, from conservatives, from conservative police chiefs, and they really have a script. So with policing, the script is very easy, it's very predictable. They will say any change that increases police accountability or restricts how and when police can use force will either endanger officers or endanger the community. That is their script. They've been doing this for a long time. It's been very successful for them. Few people have challenged it using data, which is why the stop and frisk work was so powerful. And so what we were able to do with this study was show that actually the police departments that had the most restrictive policies on how and when police use force were the safest for the community members and the safest for officers. And when we bring that data into the conversation, it completely shuts down the opposition because they don't even have any data to contest that. They don't even have the basic data to do that analysis. And it completely they're not used to actually being challenged using any facts or data. They're used to their sort of perspective carrying the day because it's been heard, because a lot of people have believed it, because it's an assumption that people make. And I think when you're able to collect that data and really challenge those narratives, I think it has been successful in getting police departments to change their policies, and it has started to impact rates of use of force.
Thanks. And Vince, I want to ask you, actually, in the interest of time, a different question, unless you have something you really want to say to the data question, but on culture of change of the institutions, given your work on stop and frisk. And I think this issue, Sam, that you kind of foregrounded so well, because part of this political economy, particularly on policing, but not exclusively on policing, is this notion of who is on the other side of it and what are they arguing, and what their moral claim is, right? And in the case of police officers, it's my life matters too. And so because I do think you've helped make culture change in the New York City Police Department through litigation. I think policies, like to your point, Sam, on excessive force actually help start to bring about culture change. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that we don't find and lift up enough successes, and successes where we're able to confer credit on whether it's police departments or prosecutors' offices for things that they're starting to do right and well, because then it keeps it as a pitched battle rather than starting to find the common cause and elevate it. Are there things that you would point to in any point in the system, in places where you've worked, where you think you can elevate that?
Yeah, it's a challenge because, and it's not a challenge because there aren't good things happening. There are a lot of really, really good things happening. There's a whole new crop of police chiefs that are considered progressive police chiefs and are really coming into police departments with a culture change format that they'll tell people right up front, if you guys are going to do all this bad stuff, I don't want you. And they tell the recruits, if you're going to do this good stuff, I do want you. So I think that there's a lot of stuff there. Where I'm at, though, just to complicate the question a little bit, is there are kind of two pieces of the swamp that I think need to be addressed in the context of culture change in order for us to be able to move forward. And I think we're all, as a society, in the process of confronting these two issues. And I think one of them is technology, but not just from the data perspective, which I think is really key. And I would also want to point out, just to say that we, in this country, policing has not been done in an evidence-based, data-based way for a very long period of time. And a lot of the data crunching and things like that were happening in academic institutions. And now what we're seeing is tech folks are democratizing that data question and using it both for community advancement and to be able to have dialogue from the community to the police departments, which is really important. You shouldn't have to have lawyers having that dialogue. It's really better that way. So that's extraordinary. The two things I would say, one is I think one of the biggest impediments to cultural change nationally is the police union. And what I mean, a shorthand way of saying that would be, if you think about all of the strategies that are being deployed in communities, the main targets are always the mayor, the police chief, and very often the city legislature, city council here, city legislature. And it is relative, now I want to say it's easy, but we've had some real success in moving out old dinosaur police chiefs that just want to bang everybody's heads and bring in new police chiefs that actually want to think about smart ways to police the community. The driving drumbeat, though, that creates the fear against which mayors and police chiefs and city government, city legislators are cognizant of at best and fearful of at worst is the police narrative, the union narrative that says, number one, our cops are getting killed and beaten up constantly because of these reform policies. And two, that we're going to pull our political support as a police union. You can't get elected in most places unless you get police union support, and they use that political power as well. So one of those strategies that I think we're coming to is what do we do about the police union? And I do want to say that Campaign Zero has really done extraordinary work on wrestling with the question of police unions and contracts and different things like that. And the second piece goes back to the data question, but it's about, I want to just sort of frame the idea of police body cams as both a positive and a challenge. And the positives are pretty obvious in terms of police body cams, because I think we've seen some evidence even before they were widely introduced that it does at least raise the level of transparency in terms of what happens in interactions. And there was a lot of stuff around the edges. When do you turn your camera on? When do you turn your camera off? What do you do with when you're videoing people that haven't done anything, that sort of thing. But getting back to the question of incentivizing it, there's another piece of body cams that's a challenge. Body cameras aren't free. Right? And even in our stop and frisk litigation, the judge ordered that the New York City pilot program on body cameras be implemented. Now, on our side, we didn't ask for it, but that's what she said needed to happen. So one of the challenges is that you have to sort of ask yourself, who makes the body cameras? And so, you know, Sam was talking about Taser and whether you can Taser somebody, but Taser is actually one of the largest makers of body cameras. And so when you think then about this national move by police departments to move towards body cameras, you have to ask yourself kind of there's a weird thing that happens. Number one is that very often in the communities, people will say body cameras are awesome because it will keep the police accountable. People will show that they're beating the crap out of us, and it'll also show that we're not doing anything wrong. Police departments are saying the body cameras are awesome because they're going to show that it's going to deter the general public from acting rudely and badly towards us, and it'll show that we're doing everything right. And so now we have both sides of the coin that are now invested in this question of body cameras, and that counties and police departments and cities are now issuing bonds because they cost a lot of money in order to invest in body cameras. And so if you look at it from the policy perspective, you've got actually a really interesting solution. If you look at it from the community perspective, essentially black and brown communities are paying their tax money to the city so that the city can pay Taser, so that Taser can give the police department body cameras so that the cops don't beat them up. It's a weird scenario where if you think about it in a policy context, there's a lot to be learned from it. But if you think about it in terms of a community control and invest-divest question, it's not so easy. So I think we have a lot of work to do on this.
And I'm going to complicate what you just said, Vince. Okay. As someone who chaired the Civilian Complaint Review Board, and I am publicly on record supporting body cameras, and publicly on record as saying the issues around privacy and surveillance are real, and the issue of policies around how they're managed are extremely important, and we're not having enough transparent conversation around them. But the reason I want is to say the police union, there are lots of different police unions. Even in New York City, there are multiple police unions. There's not just one, because there's a police union for rank and file, there's a police union for sergeants, for captains, for lieutenants, and each one of those are separate unions. And they're not all the same in terms of the ability to have conversations with them around reform, so we should note that. But I will say why we've been publicly from the civilian oversight standpoint supportive is because we've seen a dramatic increase in our ability to resolve cases and make recommendations on police discipline because of film footage, right? And so that's not a disagreement with your point, because I think you very well framed the tensions. But I will say that, and I will say, having had conversations with the police department, there is an interest on the side of the police department. They know they have bad actors, and they also need help to actually have evidence to go after their bad actors. Okay, and they think they have a lot of good cops, and there'll be a lot of good police officers who are also vindicated by it. And I think that this is where the technology and society in general continues to become a tension point, no matter what we're talking about. In the context of bail, artificial intelligence, right, machine learning, actually being the mechanism to decide whether someone's a risk. So I think the point is we're going to have the reality of technology, and how do we use it in a way that is supportive of the kind of inclusive and safe and fair communities we want. I want to open it up so we can get some of your questions and thoughts in. Before I do, though, I don't want us to miss spending a little bit of time on what happens after jail or prison, right? Because we have ban the box policies that have been one, and I've worked on and very much a supporter of ban the box when I was in the mayor's office. And yeah, now there's some research that's emerging that is suggesting that ban the box, which has may also be increasing discrimination against applicants for jobs. So ban the box, for those who don't know, is laws in various cities or states that say you can't ask someone about their criminal history before making a conditional offer. And in the case of New York City, you can only ask after the conditional offer, and you can only take criminal history into account if it relates to the actual job. So if I'm applying to be an accountant and the claim is that I stole money from my employer, that could be used against me. But if it's completely unrelated to the job I've been offered, it can't be used against me. So I just wanted to throw out a little bit about your thoughts about what's kind of happening after incarceration and some of the steps we are taking or need to take to ensure that people have opportunities on the other end, and that we're not, and how we address the fact that we're still a racialized society, and sometimes our positive policy steps don't always have the impact that we intend.
Yeah, it's deep because there are so many different ways in which, once you have a criminal record, your life is impacted. And again, that also depends on where you are. So in many places, you can't vote. So like in Florida, you are permanently disenfranchised. And there are 1 in 4 Black residents of Florida is prohibited from voting because they have a felony record. And so you think about presidential elections. I mean, that's Florida, Trump won by 100,000 votes. There were 500,000 Black people who were prohibited from voting from this law that was adopted in 1868, right after emancipation, explicitly with the goal of preventing Black people from having political power. So that's huge. In many places, you can't get access to like Medicaid. You can't get access to food stamps, cash assistance, welfare. So all of these things are really, really important to your ability to survive, to integrate back into society, to find pathways into the workforce, and that's not even getting to ban the box, right? Which is again a huge piece. Although something that again we have to wrestle with the underlying racism, and this gets back to this issue of culture. What we've talked about today is a system that at every level displays a deep racial bias. And so that is not a coincidence. And no fixing one area of the system is going to stop the prevailing cultural force that has put people in power who have the view and the approach that is to adopt policies that continually have this effect. And then even when you have policies that are race neutral, they end up getting enforced in a racially biased way. And so we have to deal with the underlying perceptions that that allow for these decisions to be made, these policies to get adopted, and them to be enforced in these ways. So all of that is to say, I think when we talk about the reentry side of things, we have to look at what works. And so it is pretty clear that what works is people need a basic level of resources when they get out of prison and a basic level of support in order to integrate back into society. This is not rocket science. Like, this is really common sense. In some places, in other countries like Norway, they literally set you up with a home, a place to live, a job, and like the support that you need, the basic like ID and other support that you need to be a part of society. And that is not the case here. Here, you sort of get dropped off with sometimes $40, sometimes $100, which then they have a surcharge on that card that they get you. So it's actually much less than that, and that's it. You're just sort of thrown out there, and you have to fend for yourself. And in many cases, that is impossible to do, given all of these barriers. And so we have to be investing on that side of things as well, to literally connect people to opportunities and to have a chance at reintegrating in society.
Okay. Yes. We'll start here and move our way around. Okay. Yeah, start here and then there. Oh, here.
Thank you for being here, of course, and thank you for the, as always, insightful, interesting discussion. I was wondering about a topic you haven't really touched upon, namely, since 1975, crime rates have indeed risen with, what is it, 700%?
Incarceration has risen 700%.
Incarceration has risen with 700%. But I was also wondering, since that time, a little later, during the Ronald Reagan era, privatized prisons have also been on the come up. And I was wondering if you in your fields have done any research in terms of correlations between the rise of privatized prisons and the rise of incarceration.
So I think in big picture, private prisons have emerged as a strategy that is increasingly being utilized, not only in terms of prisons, but also immigrant detention centers. Particularly under this administration, they've seen their profits skyrocket. They've announced plans, I think, to increase by 450% the immigrant detention capacity. So this is a strategy that is being used more and more, and something that is not as well researched as it should be. So what we know is that, and I could be wrong, I'm sure there are other studies here, but what we know is that, one, the conditions in private prisons are worse, that you are less safe if you are incarcerated in a private prison, that you are kept there for longer, because they have an incentive to fill those beds, keep those beds filled at the quota in order to continue to make money, and that they have these lockup quotas, right? So many of the contracts that states will make, and in some counties will make with private prison companies, will involve lockup quotas. So if the quota will be, so 80% or 90% of beds have to be filled in order for, or there's an extra charge. So that means that as a jurisdiction, you have an incentive then to keep people incarcerated, to lock up more people, to fill those seats or those beds. And so that becomes a really pernicious incentive to increase incarceration. In terms of how do we address this, well, like these are contracts that are negotiated. Most of them are public. You can find them. You can see when they expire. You can see what the lockup quota is. You can see what other types of things are negotiated in those contracts. And so there has to be a coordinated effort at every state, right? Because most of the advocacy has been at the federal level, and this federal government needs to continue to have pressure, but they are kind of going to do what they're going to do because they really don't care about what people have to say. And that's just the reality. So we have to continue to apply pressure at the federal level, particularly with the issue of immigration, but we also have to be active at every other level of government, particularly in states where we can actually make some progress, where the legislature might be more willing to address this issue. And you have states that have actually banned contracting with private prisons. And so I think that is a way to approach this, particularly given that the majority of the prison population is actually at the state level. So that is an opportunity, one, figure out when those contracts expire, and then engage in trying to get them to not renew or reauthorize those contracts so that we can begin to phase out the use of private prisons.
And with respect, may I just? And with respect to immigration, so we're not a research organization; we're a litigation organization. So we basically take all of this great research and we just sue somebody about it. But one of the lawsuits that we have has been a Freedom of Information Act request around federal immigration beds. And so if you go to our website ccrjustice.org and you put in the search bar bed mandate, you'll find that we've been challenging a federal mandate that actually happened during the Obama era that essentially required, as a matter of the federal budget, that 34,000 immigration beds be filled. And of course, back in those days, we thought, wow, those were the good old days when actually you were thinking, that's outrageous, we can shame this government into doing something else. And as a result, the Obama administration said, we're not going to be doing private prison work with respect to immigration. It's an open question with respect to criminal justice, but everything kind of flipped. Just one quick story around the question of corporations and how powerful they are, and what an interesting question. So we sued the federal government on a Freedom of Information Act request that give us all of the information around these contracts that you have with private prisons. The federal government said, okay, we will turn this information over. And rather than getting the information, the private prison companies tried to intervene into the case. And the private prison companies said, even though you're asking the federal government for this, it actually, we have a privacy interest in that, so we want to stand in the shoes of the federal government, so we're going to say that you can't give this stuff over. So we had this big battle that actually went up through the appeals court. We won in the appeals court, and it went to they tried to send this to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't take it. The point there is if we have to remember that we are not just battling policy with respect to the state, we're also battling policy with respect to what I call an incentivized state, which is largely around the connection between the private prisons or private entities and state government.
And we could have added corrections union in the political economy discussion.
First, thank you for a wonderful discussion. Second, in the category of what works, what sort of data have you found with respect to the hiring of increased numbers of minority police?
I'll just say a little bit about New York City, which is there has been a significant emphasis on trying to, because the numbers of officers of color has actually stagnated after an increase, and a lot of attention paid to that. I think the issue becomes not just the race of the officer, but the training, and to Sam's point, the policies around how the officers are told their policy implementation, because there certainly can be officers of color who are actually also accused of misconduct, not just white officers.
Yeah, so to this point, I think having a police force that reflects the community is important, and I think there's for a whole host of reasons. One, the economics of it. So you think about the city spending all of this money on it, like 40% of the budget goes to the police department. In many cities, all of that money goes to hire white men to fill those roles, and so you're literally spending tax dollars from everybody else in the community to hire a very particular group of people, often that are not even living in the city, and you're basically excluding economic opportunities for everybody else. On the side of how do we address police violence and over-policing, there's also an emerging body of research that suggests that police departments that have above a particular threshold of black officers are less likely to kill black civilians. And so the threshold is 40%. And so this is important because what that suggests is that just hiring more officers of color along the margins doesn't have an impact, but hiring enough that it actually changes the culture of the department. That's where you start to actually have an impact on policing practices. And so that has to be, so for example, in Connecticut, they recently passed legislation that actually incentivizes departments to begin hiring, to create a plan and to begin increasing the number of officers of color on the force. And so this is a piece of legislation, a model that could be adopted in other places as well. But it is one part of a much broader universe of solutions, because ultimately those officers, if there's not an accountability structure that can hold them accountable when they break the rules, if the rules and the standards aren't restrictive enough to prevent them from using force in ridiculous situations, then ultimately it's not going to be a solution in and of itself, but it's certainly a piece of the puzzle.
I'm getting tired, so one point I meant to raise is gender. Because we also have an increasing number of women in police departments, but it's also very clear, and a lot of those women, particularly in New York City, are women of color. And actually, gender has a significant impact also on, in just at least at the aggregate, on the amount of violence that might happen in a transaction on a police interaction. We shouldn't lose gender in that. Yes.
I want to thank you for having a series of wonderful classes. But I'm concerned about, and there's more attention lately, but school to prison, the increased use, is there data supporting the increased use of police and, of course, racialization of writing on a desk is now vandalizing, and a child can be pulled out of a classroom and accused of, a 7-year-old could be accused of vandalizing and being charged with a misdemeanor. So is there data to support or data to push back against this school to prison pipeline, which I know is a problematic way of articulating it, but that's all I have right now.
Yeah, so this is an area that, so I'm a little bit rusty on the school to prison pipeline, in part because that was work that I was very focused on in about 2012, 13. But in terms of the data, it's very clear who is victimized by policing in schools. It's very clear that you are more likely to be referred to law enforcement if you are a black or brown student. It is very clear that there has been an increase in the use of police in schools, and that this has happened in many ways in a racialized way, where you see decades ago, you had a lot of fear about school shootings after, Columbine and other incidents that happened in predominantly white schools and predominantly white areas. And the response was, we need to have police in schools. We need to have, school resource officers to protect against these really high-profile, extreme events. But those police were sent to schools that were with majority students of color. And that created this environment where it became a criminal offense doing things that kids do. So you get in a fight at school and suddenly that's assault or battery, right? And as you said, with writing on the desk could be vandalism. And so in terms of how to like pull back against it, one, we need to be decriminalizing what they call like status offenses or school disturbance laws. So in South Carolina, for example, a school disturbance is a crime in the criminal code. And so, you actually, as a student doing basic stuff that we all did in school, now all of a sudden you are considered a criminal by that law enforcement officer that's right there in your school. And they can arrest you, and we've seen videos of students, ripped out of their seats. So we need to be decriminalizing schools, decriminalizing types of status offenses. So in many places, you have offenses where if you're not 21, right, if you have, alcohol or marijuana in places even that legalized it, that's still a criminal offense. And so you're still seeing students being arrested in schools for these things, even in places that have legalized for adults these types of behaviors. And so we have to figure out how to, one, decriminalize offenses, two, pull back on police in schools altogether, and while we're phasing out police in schools, adopt very clear policies on how and when police can be involved in a particular situation. And so you're seeing school districts now adopting policies that specify, unless there is a situation where there is a physical threat that is like an imminent threat and there's a weapon involved, then we are going to handle this through the school disciplinary process instead of by calling the police. And so you have to be very specific about, what are those particular things that while the law enforcement is here at the school that they can be involved in, what they can't be involved in, as we're pushing to continue to phase out that role.
And if I can add to that, I was actually working on this issue in 2004, 2005, as a result of the No Child Left Behind Act that created a national incentive to be able to push kids out of school, separating, making these standards about what are performing schools, what are underperforming schools. And there's another piece of this which I want to just lift up, which is that in that pipeline, the school to prison pipeline, there are two different structures for lawyering and prevention. There's a whole body of law related to school suspension and school discipline. There's a whole body of law related to criminal justice. And in the past, in the bad old days, the school people didn't know what the criminal people were doing. The criminal people didn't know what the school people were doing. So creating that pipeline was actually more than just a clever phrase. It was actually a way to begin to link the strategies that were happening. And the piece that I think is important is that even as we get police out of schools, we have a separate problem, which is how do we ensure that kids aren't being pushed out of school through heightened disciplinary policies, zero tolerance policies. And I think an important connection to the question of disability. Charters, I'm sure they do. The question of disability also becomes important because when we think about school disturbance, it is, I'm sure I caused a couple of disturbances, and there are ways that you can go through your school day and create what other folks see as a disturbance. Sometimes those things have some relationship to disability. So for folks, I keep saying folks, for kids with certain types of disabilities and neither a school structure or a criminal justice structure that knows how to factor that in, we're digging deep into that pipeline and really pulling out a range of folks kids that need social services and to need some understanding, and we're actually pushing them out of school and pushing them into the criminal justice system.
And can I add that this is one of those places where we could have coalition with law enforcement, because mental illness is the thing that we don't talk about and we haven't addressed as a public policy matter in this country. And it's both in schools but also in communities. A large percentage of those who are getting caught up in the criminal justice system are beginning with mental health issues that aren't being addressed as mental health issues. And police officers actually know it, and they don't want to, at least many of the ones I've talked to, they don't want to be the first line for people who have mental health issues. So just like gun control, it's actually an opportunity area to actually think about dealing with some of the root causes, that understand that we need to support people rather than criminalize them. And I think we see the same thing in schools with children with learning disabilities or other behavioral issues that are mental health issues.
So yeah, once again, thank you guys for this. It's been really interesting to hear about where sort of organizing intersects with data. Because it's nice to be like, no, here are some numbers that prove that this thing that you thought was actually trash. But for me, going back to the organizing, and specifically going back to the police often being the first line of defense when anything goes wrong, I'd like to talk a little bit about abolition, right? So the movement for Black Lives have, one of their biggest points is divesting money from the police and the military and investing that money into the social services people need, that often the police stand in for. People don't know what to do when someone is having a mental health crisis, so they call the police. People don't know what to do when they are feeling unsafe or whatever, or there's something happening, so they call the police because they literally don't have another option. So is there data around communities that have begun to self-police, that have begun to practice community security and safety? Is there data around organizations that support creating those programs, tools, training in communities, and how has that shifted the way that people in those communities use the police? And as a person who's in an organization who is actively an abolitionist organization, we're always saying, no, we are not going to work with the police. No, they can't come to our events. No, we don't want you in our faces. We will not work with you, period, end of sentence. Like, what are ways that we can start to put those little pieces into larger conversations like these so that we don't have to work with the police if we don't want to?
There's not enough data. There should be data because it's really important. There are examples of promising practices. So, for example, there are many cities where you have conflict de-escalators that are community people who have been formerly incarcerated in many cases, whose job it is to de-escalate situations without needing to involve law enforcement. So you see that in Safe Streets in Baltimore, you see that in many different places. That there is evidence that reduces the number of shootings. So that is a promising practice, and it does this at a fraction of the resources that are spent on police. There are other cities that have approaches that are involving mental health providers, social workers in these issues of mental illness, where there will be a call. Oftentimes the call goes to law enforcement. The person is displaying symptoms of mental illness or is known to have mental illness. And so a mental health provider will be the responder. So in places like the mental health evaluation unit in Los Angeles has this, for example, where the mental health provider is the responder to that situation. They do also have police as backup, but they're not the primary responders. Now, my preference would be that this is actually without the police there. But again, even in those situations, you see a significant reduction in use of force and all kinds of problematic outcomes. So this is being done in pockets. There is some legislation, for example, that passed in Texas this session, Texas of all places, that actually funds mental health providers as responders to these situations. It creates a statewide grant program to do that. The problem that they're experiencing now is that they have these grant resources, they've authorized it, and they're having trouble figuring out who to distribute those resources to because there was not a good accounting of the community organizations doing that work. And in many cases, those organizations were not supported to know that this opportunity is available, to apply, and to outcompete some of the sort of more established, like well-resourced groups. And so that's sort of so there are pockets of effective practice that there is data that they work, that involve community members as first responders, but they are invested in only a fraction as much as police are invested in those same areas. And so to get to abolition, we have to phase out that funding in police and scale up those alternatives. And so that is the conversation around invest, divest. It has to be, in order to get there, it takes this type of research from Patrick Sharkey that can help provide sort of the underlying data-driven rationale for why this investment is a better investment than that investment. And I think that that information, that data is becoming more and more available. Those studies are coming out more and more frequently, and it's about how do we take that and use that in those conversations with policymakers to continue to accelerate that trend. Ultimately, this is something this shift in paradigm is happening because of organizers like yourself making that case and helping people to see things differently. And so in many ways, we have to figure out how to continue to create, through state legislation, through citywide programs, the opportunity for those competitive grants to start scaling up these programs so that more and more of them can be in place, and so that more resources can sort of can build on top of an existing infrastructure once that's been built.
Yeah, I appreciate that question about the organizers as well, because I think at least in the legal field, we focus a lot on what we're fighting as opposed to focusing on what we're building. And I think it's not just an organizer question, but I think that actually organizers are the best to sort of lead us through this process with communities. And the question is the following thing: if whatever community that you're from, if you were to ask yourselves, if I were to build this whole thing over again, would I build it the same way that it's built now? The answer is no. And I want to just sort of say a word about policy, because I think thinking about this just in a policy framework, I think limits our vision about what's possible, because policy as a tool tends to limit and to limit resources either in one direction or the other. So the policies can be, these are the limitations that we're going to do on the black community. Y'all can't vote if you're felons. You can't do this if you've done that. And that we see some shifts that put some policy limitations on the police departments. You have to do this in order to do that. And the policy piece is important. But my sense is that that's not the place that communities really need to start. They actually need to start about dreaming about how they would reconfigure the question of public safety. What would we want the response to be if our brother has a mental health issue? And let's be real about it. And when he doesn't take his medication, he's very, very, very violent. I'm very nervous about it. And people hold this thing like, am I going to get beat up by my brother, or am I going to call the police and have him get beat up? And those are the question of how to get out of that. I think really there's some vibrancy in the community that we see, and I would love to see that percolate, and then the data heads and the policy heads and all of y'all really, really smart folks are thinking about how do we then take that vision and actually move that thing forward.
I just want to add one point, because I think all the points that have been made are so important, and that's to remember that we're talking in a bubble right now, because very many of the communities of color that I've had conversations with don't want abolition. 41% of black people are victims of shootings, and 20% of the population in the top 60 police precincts. They're not asking for abolition of the police. The rape rates and assault rates in communities of color, particularly poor ones, are extremely high. I say that only to say that I actually think, Vince, your formulation was really good. And it's not to stop the question and the conversation. It's also to remember that when we had the same conversation about abolition of these state mental health facilities that were such horrible places where people were essentially incarcerated because they had mental health issues, and we deinstitutionalized that, our homelessness rates jumped radically, because actually the other part of the demand wasn't met, which was that there be more realistic community-based structures that could absorb folks who needed then support services. So I think this is an important conversation to be having with communities, particularly recognizing that a lot of the communities we're talking about who are over-policed and over-incarcerated also don't necessarily say the things that some of us would say in these conversations, and we should recognize that and actually have these dialogues in communities. Let's one last question. Yeah, and then we'll have to wrap, but thank you for coming, for those who are leaving.
How y'all doing? I don't have to say my name, right? My name is Oliver. First of all, I do want to recognize and appreciate, I appreciate all you guys do, just for the culture and everything you're doing for police reform and to make this a better place and a better city. I appreciate facts, so I appreciate all the numbers and stuff that you guys have. Another fact that I appreciate is that, and I recognize, is that some police officers are just racist. Like they're just culturally insensitive people. And these are people who have the badges and who have the guns and ultimately have the power in the scene of my interaction with them or anybody's interaction with them. That's just a fact. In an interview, I think it was 2014 with Dick Gregory, he was being interviewed on this podcast called Real Black. And they asked him about police interaction. And the question was, how do we stop it? How do we stop the violence of police shooting young black men and women in the city? And he kind of alluded to the fact where he's like, you didn't like me before you put on the badge. You didn't like me before you put on your uniform this morning. And I recognize that no legislation could pass to get the person to like you or understand your background and stuff like that. But one thing he did say that I wanted to target was, which is kind of leading to my question, is he said that instead of taking money away from police, give them something to lose. So he said, like, why don't we let their children go to school for free? You know, like, and then if you get found, you know, guilty, whatever the case may be, of, you know, misconduct, you get taken away. And that way you have to decide, do you hate me more than you love your family? And I know that a lot of these officers are underpaid and overworked. And so sometimes the pulling of the trigger is fear, but it's also stress sometimes. So just wanted to get your guys' perspective on that kind of policy, if it would be effective or not.
You know, I don't think so, in part because I think police do receive a whole host of benefits that, you know, regular folks don't receive. And so, you know, and again, it depends by city, but, you know, there are cities where police are paid $90,000 starting. San Francisco, $80,000, $90,000 starting. Austin, Texas, I was just in Austin, Texas a couple of weeks ago, where they're negotiating the police union contract there. And in their police union contract, there are all kinds of, well, first of all, police union contracts in general are a huge issue that few people talk about, but has a huge role to play in why it's so hard to hold officers accountable, even if the police department wants to. So in Austin, they have a range of provisions in the contract, like it erases your record of misconduct after a certain amount of time. If it takes the department longer than 180 days to investigate a complaint of misconduct against an officer, they have to throw out that complaint. They can't discipline the officer as a consequence, so they can just drag their feet and not have to do anything about it. Meanwhile, these are the highest paid officers in the state, among the highest paid officers in the nation, and at the negotiation between the police union and the city was demanding, because activists were putting pressure on them, the city was demanding that those provisions in the contract be removed so that officers can be held accountable just like anybody else working at any other job. And the police union said, we won't make any of those changes unless you pay us substantially more. And this isn't just happening in Austin, it's happening in Chicago right now, it's happening in many different cities. And so I think it illustrates that even in places where officers get paid more than any other city employees, you have officers, when you factor in overtime, making over $100,000 in many different places, paid more than the mayor in some places. And still, to get the bare minimum of accountability, they're demanding more money. And so I don't think that there is a benefit. I don't think giving them more benefits is going to necessarily make them any more likely to be accountable. However, they do get a lot of benefits that could potentially be jeopardized if they break the rules, right? So, for example, the pension of the officer. Why is it that an officer who has a repeated history of misconduct does not have their pension called into question, unless the only time the pension actually gets called into question is if you are convicted of a serious felony in many states. And as we know, and you look at the data, only 1% of officers who kill a civilian are ever convicted of a crime. And they actually end up getting much less of a sentence than a civilian convicted of the same crime. So it's pretty much impossible for an officer to get convicted of a crime, even for the most egregious acts. So, you know, that serious felony never even comes into play. So we have to think about how do we actually create meaningful consequences and think about how they can actually play a role given the current structure. So, you know, for example, we know that police officers that have more than 2 complaints of excessive force in a given quarter are more likely to be involved in a third event, right? There are early warning systems that many police departments adopt where they can identify these officers. They have a list of officers that are sort of the highest risk officers, and they still are not disciplined. And so we have to have an accountability structure that works to even have a conversation about how to make these policies meaningful. And that means having a civilian oversight structure that has the power to independently investigate complaints and discipline officers instead of having to go through the police chief. It means that we are removing things from the police union contract that make it harder to discipline those officers. So like, for example, in Philadelphia, there's a provision in their contract where after an officer is disciplined, the officer can appeal to an arbitrator. And if that arbitrator finds another officer that didn't get the same amount of discipline for the same thing, they can reinstate that officer plus back pay. So 68% of officers who are fired from Philadelphia Police Department are rehired plus back pay because of that provision. So literally, you have to address these underlying issues in the contract, in the accountability structure, and in the standards that influence whether or not that officer is just determined to break the rules to really be able to start addressing this issue of accountability.
Wow, that's why I was talking about police unions, y'all. So, Oliver, I heard two questions there. One is, how do you disincentivize bad behavior and create accountability, which I think Sam answered beautifully. And then the other question, which is sort of Dick Gregory asked, is how do you disincentivize racism? And that's not a policing question. It's a vexing one. So here's my take on it, which is, and this goes back to the cultural question, and goes back to your question about what difference does it make to have black police officers and black people in blue uniforms as opposed to white people. That the police function developed in our country from two different parts of the country. There's a southern version of it and the northern version of it. The southern version of it was around slave patrols, and that was about people who were escaping slavery. This was a mechanism by which they would be brought back. The northern piece is largely about unionization and pushing back against people in the North, particularly poor people in the North, that were looking to unionize and to have a sort of a living wage. So if we take those sort of core functions of policing, neither one of them actually have to do with criminalization and crime, one of which has to do with race and the other one doesn't. Then I think it gives us a different way of looking at it, which is then how has that function shifted over time to the present day? And I think in Dick Gregory's day, and I think in the 1950s, 40s, 30s, and moving up into the 1960s, particularly where there were no black police officers, where and every major black rebellion, also called riots, were either done because of white mobs that were killing black communities or because of white police officers who were beating and killing people, that there is a self-fulfilling prophecy with respect to policing in the black community. And so I think that it is better to think about it as a structural racism problem as opposed to an individual officer problem. And so that gets back to the question of culture. So, if we were to dream a little bit about how we would create a police department, the first question we would ask is, what do we need a police department for? And with respect to if it doesn't solve the problem to have all black police forces or even necessarily all women police forces, because if we did those things, it might solve the police violence problem to a certain degree, but it wouldn't solve the over-policing problem necessarily. It wouldn't necessarily solve the racial profiling problem. It wouldn't necessarily solve the sentencing project problem, or the unionization problem, or the deep end of the system problem. So at some level, I think we have to be more sophisticated in thinking about race not as an amalgam of individual racism, but looking at what structures we're creating to oppress black and brown communities. And if we do it that way, then we might think about different incentives in order to keep our structures from functioning the way that they're actually supposed to. There's this other thing about policing, which is that we spend a lot of time in the reform movement saying, yeah, the system is broken. They're not doing it the right way. If they did it this way, it would have more equitable outcomes. But there's another way of looking at it, which is that the police function, not any individual police department, is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And if it's doing exactly what it's designed to do, then it raises the question that the sister asked, which is not so much about individual racism, but about what are we investing in a society that continues that, and why is it that we think that we can law enforcement our way out of broad societal problems that essentially law enforcement can have a tendency to exacerbate rather than resolve.
So we're beyond time. The questions were excellent, but I also really just want to thank Sam and Vince, for coming and spending this time with us and sharing so much knowledge and information. So much we didn't touch on because it's such a large system. I mean, for all the points that were made about policing, we could have made about prosecution. We could have made about what happens in all the different stages of the system. I just hope that when you leave here, you will continue to investigate, just because there's so many parts of the system we didn't address. And I'd actually invite, there's something that's been coming up sort of over and over again in the context of the course, and next week is our last, and you gave us a couple of nice segues there, Sam, because we're going to talk about voting rights, and I'm sure felony disenfranchisement is going to be one of the issues that comes up next week, is this notion of who do we talk to and how do we talk to them? Because there's been a lot of tension, I think, in the class around who do you talk to and who do you not. And I want to invite and challenge us by next class around whether or not we're willing to have hard conversations with people who don't think like us. Because having a lot of conversations with a lot of police officers in the New York City Police Department, I actually agree with everything, including it's very important not to individualize it. They actually have really bad working conditions, notwithstanding all your very accurate points about pay. Because I think there's a distinction between pay and pension and working condition, and also whether or not the conditions of employment, particularly for people of color and women, start to be the same for white male officers. So there actually are some issues to deal with in terms of the officer experience, but consistent with the points around policy and around oversight and around doing a lot more to ensure that there's real accountability, which I think is critically important. So thank you all.